actually give yourself some me time in writing. It's one of the only occasions in which you get to sit down and actually say, what am I interested in? Why? How does my interest in X and gender relate to my interest in international communities or imagined communities, for example? How do these pieces of my framework really flow together in a logical way? So I would invite you to think early about where you're going to apply, and not just for logistical reasons, but also so you can really devote a lot of time to thinking about your research project. And the fellowship proposal is an opportunity to say, I can't do other things right now, I have to really think about it. So I think that's a fun way to humanize our research proposal. So I'm going to talk, I'm a social scientist, or I'm on the social science end of the humanities. And so what I'm talking about comes from things I've read, but also a lot of my own research as a participant observer, sitting on grant review things, hearing what people say, finding commonalities. So I'm going to try to give you that insider's perspective today. The main goal that I have is to help you to think like a reviewer, because then you'll be able to, I think, edit and write your own work in a reviewer-friendly way. And yeah, I'll stop there. So I'm going to talk about the peer review process. What is it like? What are those people looking for? And then I'll turn that into some steps for things to think about when you're writing, what to make sure to include, checklists of sorts for yourself. I'll end briefly, talk about ways to improve your grants writing, and not sure we'll get to the end, but the exercise at the end, but we'll see how we do. So the peer review process can work differently at different places, depending on the size of the organization and the nature of the organization. So Bonnie Efros spoke about a variety of kinds of things. There were large interdisciplinary programs like the Mellon ACLS postdoctoral fellowships. Those really have two stages of peer review. The first stage they're often referred to as the screeners. These tend to be associate professors, sometimes assistant professors, who receive packets of proposals by mail or by email now, and go through and kind of grade them and see what rises to the top. And then these pre-screened proposals then go to reviewing bodies of mainly full professors who meet in person at the Granting Foundation headquarters in DC, for example, or New York City. And those people really sit around a table and hash it out. And so from the point of view of a writer, when you think that there's going to be people around a table talking about your work and comparing it to other proposals, you're looking to really secure a champion in that audience. You're looking to secure someone who's going to fight for your proposal. And so you're writing in a way such to engender that kind of support. And that's a little more personal than what we do in our research papers. So things to bear in mind. The second point here is smaller or disciplinary specific programs. Again, you'll have a first stage of screeners, but then it might be a program staff member or a group of program staff who do the second stage review and the final decisions. And then finally, you'll have fellowships offered by a particular university or library. They know exactly what they're looking for, and either a group of scholars at that place or scholars mixed with program staff, etc. They'll sit around the table and do the hashing out. So there's also some interesting things to think about in terms of what leads someone to be a grant reviewer. Some of it is prestige seeking. You want to perform yourself to colleagues. You want to meet other interesting people. You want to give back to your field. You want to champion a particular area. Maybe you've received this fellowship and you want to make sure that it continues to allocate money to things that you find important. So reviewing can be a really personal activity. And so grant writing is part of this. It's a way that we as scholars engage almost in tribal communications in a way, talking to each other, bouncing our ideas off in a different way than we would do in, say, a scholarly journal. Stop me at any point if you have questions or clarifications. Have any of you come across this book recently? It's out, a few hands. It's 2010 Harvard University Press. It's called How Professors Think, and Michelle Lamont is a sociologist at Harvard, and she also did some participant observation on grant panels. Some of those that you mentioned, Bonnie, like the SSRC's International Dissertation Field Program. She sat in on the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation grant panels. She sat in on the ACS fellowships. And she basically gives you an inside look into the process, into how people think. So I just recommend that for further reading. Again, it's important to kind of put yourself there with the reviewers and think about what they're doing when they're reading it. The first thing to know is that a lot of these panels, especially for the larger, non-specialized dissertation funding opportunities, they are really interdisciplinary. What does that mean? It means they're as interdisciplinary as we are in this room. So if someone is a linguist and they're interested in a particular phonetic area, I really don't know what that means. And there are going to be people on the review panel who don't know what that means. So you really have to write for someone who hasn't read the foundational text in your field perhaps, but is a generalist and is a generally well-educated person and likes to think across areas, but they're not going to know your jargon, and they might not know some of the particular scholarly debates in your field. So yes, a non-specialist. The other thing to know, especially in the case of the screeners, you get a packet of things in the mail, you read them over lunch maybe. You only have so much time, or you only have a day in DC to sit down and evaluate everything. So you're really constrained by time. There are these really practical issues of grant reviewing. So you do have to get yourself to the point really quickly in your proposal. And you do have to realize that if there's any proofreading errors, things like you brought up, that goes pretty quickly. And again, this is just because human beings are doing the reviewing. So, and they might be doing it over lunch, they might have blurry eyes. Think like people with blurry eyes when you edit your work and you edit each other's work. All right. So now you know how review happens. Any questions about that? Okay. So you want to apply. You're preparing to draft a proposal. I think I might be repeating a few things you mentioned, but I'll do it anyway because they're really important. Learn as much as you can about the program. That means reading every word on the website. It means seeing if there's links to past people who were funded, maybe in their newsletter. I even recommend Google searches about the funding program, just to see if maybe someone who won it, their university wrote a blurb about them. All trying to get inside the head of what that funding program might be interested in that particular year. So something else important to think about is to locate the mission statement and to think about it, because funding programs want to help you and they want to see you succeed, but more pragmatically, they also want themselves to succeed. They want to be the person who funded good work. And so you are also selling yourself to them as, here's why I'm going to help your program advance its aims. So at the end, somewhere in your proposal, I advocate at the end of the intro section, and again in the conclusion, you want to say exactly how you fit in with the mission of the funding body. And that's something I think goes overlooked a fair amount, would you say? So, and as Bonnie F. pointed out, you also want to look at previously funded projects. If they have draft applications, that's really helpful. You can even just look at how people formatted things. Did they underline or bold stuff? Was that easier to read? All of these details come into preparing a proposal. So, how are proposals evaluated? A variety of criteria. The first thing I'll say is forget what's on the slide. Foundations and funding bodies also, they do look for diversity. They look for diversity in terms of gender and race of applicants. They look for diversity of institution by geography and by kind of institution, public versus private, large versus small, etc. So they look for diversity of discipline. So even these really highly competitive things we've talked about, they want you. So don't feel as if there's some kind of a ceiling for particular institutions or disciplines, et cetera, as long as your work fits with the funding, with the criteria and aims of the funding proposal. That aside, here are the formal criteria. Clarity, that's literally just writing, not even to do with the substance of your project, how it's presented in terms of writing. Originality, the social significance, what are you contributing to the field? What are you contributing to the humanities as well? I'll come back to that point. Your methods, have you told us what you want to do and said why this is a reasonable way to do it? Quality, what does quality mean? You've done your homework. You've read and cited the appropriate literature. Engaged in a thoughtful conversation with the substance of your field and research area. Feasibility, that goes back to this idea of, do you have the right languages? Can you actually do what you need to do in the space of time that you've set out? Because if you can't, or if there's any doubts as to whether you're being overambitious, those are signs to shelf the proposal for a reviewer. And then, of course, there's other kinds of criteria, like does it fit with what we want to fund? Does it fit with the cause that we're interested in advancing, etc. Am I going too quickly? No? Okay, great. All right, so you have the fellowship criteria. Now you have to attack them. I use the word attack because my family does puzzles, and when you get those really large, like 1,000-piece puzzles, my mother always taught me to attack them. And what she meant was you put all the straight ones here, right, with the straight edge on one side, and you organize them such that you have these pieces all facing one direction, and you can go through and try them one by one, and you really parse out the puzzle such that you can approach it systematically. I would argue, and by I give credit where credit is due to BeSpecific, the library's grants manager, that you can do the same thing with fellowship application. So the advice that BeSpecific gives, which I find helpful as well, and so I'll share it with you, is to find the program evaluation criteria and then rewrite them as questions, because they're never questions, they're always statements. And it's really hard to answer a statement. Right? So you have your list of questions, and then when you go through and you're editing your proposal, you say, did I answer all the questions? So I thought we could quickly try that out. So here are the criteria from the Mellon ACLS Dissertation Completion Fellowship. We can take the first one. The potential of the project to advance the field of study in which it is proposed and make an original and significant contribution to knowledge. How would you turn that into a question? And you can have several questions, please.
How is your research and original and significant contribution to your field of study?
That's great. What else can we ask?
No, I was just cheering.
Oh, sure. Okay. That's good. What other questions?
How might your project be relevant to other fields as well?
Very good.
Especially in the humanities, obviously.
Yes, that is excellent. What else?
If it's interdisciplinary, then which are the fields and how would it be advanced or whatever?
Great, so we're stepping on, we're parsing those original questions out into sub-questions. This is exactly the way to proceed. What about the second one? The quality of the proposal with regard to its methodology, scope, blah, blah. What are some questions there we can ask of ourselves?
Like, why did you choose your particular method? Because obviously you had different options, so advocating for a specific course.
Why do I want to do this way? Great. Yeah, what else?
I guess justifications.
Pardon me?
Justifications of the project in general. Why this methodology? Why limit yourself to this kind of a scope or framework or whatever? I guess.
Yeah. Again, you phrase all those questions. So why this methodology? Why? How is this framework an important way to advance the field? Sure. What is my framework? being a crucial sub-question of that. How does my framework relate to my methodology? How can we ask questions that bring these different components of the sentence into dialogue with each other? It can be helpful, oh, please.
I was just going to say, what scholarly literature are you using and why, and what do reviewers need to know about that?
That is a very good question, definitely. So the idea is if you're armed with all these questions, then you sit down and write answers to your questions. And it can be helpful to point blank refer to evaluation criteria upon occasion. The significant contribution to knowledge of my study is, but you all know how to be subtle. But it's not a black mark. It's certainly not a bad thing to be blunt. It can be a very, very good thing. And that's not the case in scholarly publication. So it's really important to think about how writing a proposal is different than writing a research article. Fortunately, someone's written an article about that very topic. I recommend it. It is on the UF Library's Grantsmanship page. And the whole point of this great article, why academics have a hard time writing good grant proposals, is that we don't know how. We've never been trained to write a grant or fellowship proposal. We've always been trained to write in a reflexive, explication-based matter about our project. So what does it mean to upend that? Well, something very important to think about is when you're writing a fellowship proposal, you haven't done the research yet. So you can't start it like you would an article. You have to literally talk about what you'd like to do, what will be done. You have to think about this in a persuasive way. You can't explain to the reader what you haven't done. You have to sell them as to why it needs to be done. Subtle nuances of voice, but it can make all the difference in the frame that you give. I spoke about grants and fellowships having much more personal tones. It's because you are really excited about your work, and that's okay. It's good to be excited about your work. Does that mean you don't still have to treat it with a critical eye in an objective way? No, but you can say things in a fellowship proposal or grant proposal that you might not say in a research paper, in terms of this is a really important project because it will allow us to change our standpoint on X or Y or Z. You're forward thinking here. Talk about a fellowship proposal being team focused. This is because of feedback. It does take a village to write a fellowship proposal. It certainly takes your roommates and your family and your advisor and your mentors and the conversations that those people have with you about your work and the feedback they give you on your proposal. I think this bottom, the bottom comparison here is very important. Again, accessible language. The people who are reading really don't know what all those words mean that you're citing. You're going to have to define them, but in such a way, not fluid, not remedial, but have extra clauses and sentences that just do a little bit of that work for you, for example. So, how many parts are there to a fellowship proposal? I'd say roughly 5. Often the first 3 of these, your research statement, your budget, and your timeline, are packed together into one project narrative. This is a generalization. It will definitely vary by different opportunities. The important thing to know is reviewers read all of these things next to each other. And so they'll read a letter of support, and they'll read it in relation to your program statement, and they'll read your bibliography in relation to your letter. And so if there's something in your bibliography they don't understand, you might look for it in your research statement, or vice versa. And so you want to make sure that these puzzle pieces, I like puzzles, again, come together and do relate to each other effectively, that they're not disjointed. So that again is why letters of support can be very important. If you know that maybe there's a slippage somewhere here and you need someone to address it, then that letter comes in as a really crucial puzzle piece. My 2 main points on fellowship writing, again, is that it's really kind of the opposite of a research proposal. in many ways. You want to get your points in your thesis statement out front. When we write research proposals and research papers, we put all the evidence out front, right? And then we build. We build and we build and we build until we have our unique contribution. A fellowship proposal is the total inverse. Here's my contribution. Here's all the evidence of why this is important, how I'm going to go about it, etc. It's really an upside down development. And again, there's all of the context that you put in there to get the reviewers excited about your project and to be your champion. So,
Can you explain this a bit more, contextualize the proposed project, how would one do that?
I will do that on my next slide. That's perfect, thank you. So I'll next start looking at nitty-gritties of different paragraphs. And I would invite you to take everything that I'm saying not as a formula, but just as some general, like a Weberian ideal type, if you will. But certainly don't think that you have to cram your research into the framework that I'm about to provide. So your intro and your closing paragraphs are really, really important. And again, because busy people reading lunch with blurry eyes are going to be thinking about your work. So you do have to start out with a hook. And I'll talk a little more on the next slide about what that hook could be. But something to grab the reader, some kind of a big picture statement. And then you want to contextualize. So what does the reader need to understand about the context of your research question and proposed project in order to know that it's really important? What, if the BBC or the Nature Channel was going to do a really short documentary on your work, what would go into that? What would kind of those big frame questions be? That's what you want to start out with. Because if you just start out with, here's my proposed project, and again, note that it's a fellowship proposal, so it's not about your research question. It's about the project that you're doing. It's not a statement of question, it's a statement of project. It's something that will be done. So words like I plan to explore, etc., those really don't have a lot of utility in a fellowship proposal because you need to know exactly what you're doing. It's a plan of activity and action. But before you can lay out your action, you have to give the reader enough to go on so that they understand why your action and your intervention is so important. So that's what I mean by contextualizing in the first paragraph. So then your second paragraph, or towards the end of your first, again, not a formula, you want to say, well, here's what I'm going to do. Here's why it's important. Here's why the field needs it. Here's why it's original. All those questions you asked yourself. And then in the closing, either the closing of your introduction or the closing of the whole narrative, again, use your judgment. You do have to answer that so what question. Again, for reviewers who aren't in your field and discipline, even those who are, because it's always good for a reviewer to know what you think the impact of your work is. They might think it's also impactful in another way, but they'd like to know what you think its contribution is. And then, of course, this idea that you need to fit it with the mission of the funding body.
So, obviously this isn't the same as your dissertation prospectus, but a lot of it does sound the same in terms of questions you should be answering and asking yourself. Like how much should you change that from, say your perspective? I know a lot of us are in the exam prep, so I could imagine like doing these things at similar times, like working on a grant proposal from perspectives.
So how different is this from your dissertation proposal?
Yeah, like how much should you change like the approach? Because a lot of these questions seem like the same questions you should be addressing.
It should be. It should be a really symbiotic relationship. The difference being that this is going to be addressed to a more general reader. It's going to have less detail, but it's going to have higher explanatory stakes, if you will. So certainly it doesn't have to be a different document. They should definitely be evolving side by side.
But it's much more condensed.
Yeah.
Because usually with these project statements, you're given 3 pages or 2 pages. So it accomplishes many of the same things as your prospectus, but you have to really sort of put it all in there in a very brief way. But I mean, I think the project of putting together the prospectus is a really good exercise for doing this. You just have to learn to compress it, and it'll also help you on the job market, because you have to have that 3-minute, 5-minute version of what it is you're working on that you can sort of recite by heart at a certain point. And that's what the prospectus, or the application, the sort of statement of what you want to do serves many of the same functions, but it is for a much more generalist audience than the members of your committee.
Thank you.
Just because we're kind of talking about this in relation to the dissertation, is it conceivable to think about like a grant proposal as just like a dissertation chapter? Because for example, like I'm writing a chapter on African American literature, but my entire book is not going to be on African American literature. So is it conceivable to just use that one chapter as part of the grant proposal, or is it better to think about my dissertation project as a whole and how that would relate?
I would say it depends on the grant you're applying for.
Okay.
So if you're going to a library to fulfill the needs of that specific chapter, then that's fine, but I would refer to the larger project as a whole and mention that this is one piece of a bigger one. But if you're applying for one of these more general, 1-year big ones, I would say don't focus on one chapter because it'll make your work look much narrower than it is, and then I would talk about the whole thing. So I think it really depends whether you're trying to get to a library for a month or whether you want to go to, to Africa for a year to do field research. So that question will vary. So.
For fieldwork intensive projects, like often you don't know what you will find until you get there. How do you preach that? That's something I'm coming up against, because you actually don't know. You can say that I'm going to look at these kind of texts, I'm going to search at these libraries or whatever, but like for me, I'm trying to look at like a rare archive of like children's books, which for the most part I have to go and hunt actually and so how do you sort of place that? Apart from saying that this kind of an archive needs to be located, etc., and there is the importance, but I can't speak in concrete terms about a project that I don't know what it's going to be because I don't have the material yet.
That's not a bad thing. That's actually a good question, because if you did know all that, you wouldn't need to go. So you're actually in the same boat. You're in exactly the right boat. But my understanding is it's important to know enough about what you expect to find there and how those expectations fit in with your desire to propose a project in a particular area to make the case that it is worth sending you, that there's a good chance that your research will be forwarded and advanced by doing the proposed fieldwork.
I would say also from having sat on some of the review bodies is that often what makes a proposal stronger is a person will have gone there already for maybe a month, like they got a small grant to go, so that they have a sense of what's in the archives or what it's going to be like, and that they have already made the connections they need to do what they want to do. So for instance with the SSRC, it seemed like a lot of the applications where people had already taken a month there or a couple weeks or they got there somehow or they were able to, because then it makes them a more viable candidate. So I'm not saying that you have to know what your results are going to be, because obviously they're not going to fund that either if you've already done the work. But at the same time, it does help if you can somehow manage to cobble enough money together from your department to at least make an initial foray there in the summer before you make these applications. You'll be able to write a more experienced application because you'll be able to say, I've already worked it out, this is how this, or perhaps it's possible to do a lot of it online to get a good sense of what the catalog looks like, what the hours are, so how much access you're going to have to this material so that you can write a more realistic proposal. And in the case that you can't do any of these things, I think you have to basically set it up that you already know, though, at least the questions that you're going to ask when you get there, and that you can think of creative ways to deal with the situation that you encounter once you're there. But if you can make a short, brief trip beforehand, I think it does lend itself to writing a stronger application, because even though you haven't done most of the work yet, at least you know the archivists, you understand that they're going to be able to meet this need, and you're not going to get there and find that say the archive burnt down in 1817 or something like that, because this is a problem with historians. We read about a place and we think there are going to be all these manuscripts there, and then you get there and you find out that there was a war in between 300 years later that you didn't know about because you work on the medieval period and not the early modern. So you want to make sure that what you're saying is viable, that it does exist, right? So.
Definitely. I had colleagues in graduate school who they'd find a conference at the place they wanted to do field work, and they just spend an extra day there just to make some brief contacts, or they talk to somebody they knew was already doing field work in that area, and they'd say, do you have a man on the ground or woman on the ground that I could talk to? And again, a lot of catalog surfing.
So does previous experience, do you include that in your
Yes, you betcha.
project statement? Just fit it in
Yeah,
there.
or like when I went for the first time to the Archive Nationale, somebody gave me the tip on what catalog numbers to look at, you know? So sometimes talking to somebody who's been to the archive you want to go to will save you an enormous amount of work. And also the person put me in touch with the archivist they thought was very helpful, because many of them were unfriendly and this one was nicer. So I was able to email the person ahead of time, which I could have never done, and I would have likely not gotten a response if I had just written to the general email for the entire archive. So, I mean, it does help to talk to other people who've been to the place you're going to if you're not able to get there yourself, so at least you get a little bit of a sense of what's happening on the ground when you get there.
So if you have, suppose, been able to make such a research trip, and then you say that, okay, I've been able to locate these materials, but now I need to go and access them and kind of thing.
Exactly.
So that should be helpful.
I think so.
Definitely. Here's how I plan to spend my time when I'm there. And yes, things might change and unexpected circumstances and things that I think will be there won't be and vice versa. But again, you're convincing someone that you're going to be productive in that time that you're spending in a place, so that you've done your homework. I even had colleagues in grad school in anthropology who just would cold call faculty who'd written monographs in a particular area and say, I would like to go and I'd like to learn more about your research. And many of these authors were very friendly and forthcoming with their contacts. So, doesn't hurt to ask, right? Just some suggestions for making a book. There's that age-old first one, everyone's done X, no one's done Y. Without Y, we can't understand Z. But the really important thing is to not just say that the question hasn't been answered, that no one's done this, but to say, why is it a problem that no one's done this? Why do we need a new perspective or a new question? Newness itself does not justify originality and significance. Something else I like as a reader are snapshot stories. I start out with something that's going to grab me into the window of my informant's lives, for example, or into the life of this person that I want to study, etc. But no matter how you start, again, don't spend more than a few sentences or a paragraph, because you do want to get to your project right away. So now I'm just going to go on with a few things that I've observed hanging around.
Could you go to the previous slide for a second?
Sure thing. So my next few slides will just be a few points to bear in mind. Mechanics. It's not necessarily the sexiest part of grant writing, but it's quite important. Please let me know when you're ready for me to advance. Thank you. So the first is, and we really already talked a lot about this, but do be specific. Be specific about what you want to see. Be specific about the importance of your work, exactly what it ties to, who's done work in this area already. Again, imagine someone reading your narrative next to your bibliography. You can have citations. They can go back and forth. Work your bibliography. Just be specific. Grand sentences are wonderful, but the readers are going to look for pragmatics. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going slightly more quickly than I'd like right now. Again, to reiterate, you are aware of what you need to do and what skills and training you need to have to be successful. So you have your language skills, etc. You know what you might do if you encounter problems. You've read everything that you should have read. Again, these are all of those ingredients of quality. You've really approached this in a rigorous way. No stone unturned. Of course, the what are you going to do? Really, what are you going to do? Tell us. Be very specific. You're going to a library. What collections do you want to see? Why do you think they're going to be helpful to you? Again, a question was asked a moment ago. how does this particular trip fit into your whole dissertation? Is this just a chapter of your dissertation? Is it 2 chapters? Is it 3? Be very specific about what this one proposed trip or fellowship period, how it relates to your entire dissertation completion project. Again, your methods, that question that you've already all known to ask, why are these methods necessary? To be realistic, you might want to do everything and to impress everybody, but you only have so much time. So do think about what is actually possible. Some applications may ask you to take a timeline, parse it out of a narrative. Others you just refer to a timeline in the text and the prose of your narrative. But do, when you ask someone to review a draft of it, ask them to see if your timeline is clear. And if it's not, consider making it clear, even drawing it out of the narrative if you need to. And again, there's a question sometimes if you've been working on something for a long time and you're applying for funding for something, why will this make the difference, this one trip? This is something that faculty members encounter a lot. You know, you've had this manuscript project for 5 years. Now you want funding. Tell us why that's going to get it to press. So be prepared for people asking these kinds of questions of the proposal. This really, again, links to the BeSpecific. The proposal, because it's only 3 pages, has to do a lot of work for you. You have to dive out and dive in and dive out, and you need to relate the intricacies of what you're going to do and the questions that you're going to ask in your project to really large concepts like gender and theory and race relations, etc. And you might have clusters of ideas, like this proposed project will contribute to relating to understanding how gender and imagined communities relate to each other. Okay, but then you have to tell us how will they relate? How will it show it? What are those micro steps that link gender and imagined communities? So this constant wave, micro-macro articulation. I definitely heard reviewers on committees say, this person promises to answer all these great questions and tie in all these great concepts, but they've never told me how they're going to do it. So, definitely tell them. A lot of proposals will ask you for significance, for broader implications. They mean broader implications in the humanities, of course. So this is why it's really good to have a friend in another department or field who you can bounce these ideas off of. Would you want to read my work? Would you want to fund it if you were on the review committee? It's also really easy, and this goes for faculty too, I myself am guilty of this regularly, to save these kinds of things to the very end. I'm almost done, I just need to write my last few sentences. What do I think is next for me? What do I think are the questions that will be opened by the completion of this project? It's a little too late to think about it then. That's something to think about in the early stages of articulating your work. I was advised once to just keep a diary, a research diary, where every time I thought that I was onto something really cool, I'd write it down. And then I could harvest from that. And just, that diary was for me a way to keep track of the big ideas I was having, my Nobel Prize ideas, if you will. Things that I wanted to keep and mull over, but they weren't ready to come out in my research papers. So I don't know if a diary would work for everyone, but I kept it next to my puzzles. Something else to know that reviewers think about when they're reading, again, this is our anatomy slide, is that they're reading these 5 things and they're reading between them and they're looking for narratives. So you all are humanities scholars, so you're very good about reading for grand narratives. So what are the narratives that reviewers are reading for? There's the project narrative, there's the big story, the one thing that ties everything together. And there should be one story. Some people talk about this as a thought way. And the second is, what's the narrative about you, the author, in all of this, about your career, about how this work is a natural extension of your interests, why you're the best person to do this, why you're going to advance the goals of the funding body. What do we know about the narrative of this person when we read? But as I'm reminded, mean, that has to be really subtle. That you don't want to distract from the project by talking about yourself. But you do want to be aware that they're looking for evidence of you when they read. You're not, again, in a research paper, you're not this disembodied author. You're a person with projects. Here's the real nitpicky details, the grantsmanship. I think it's all pretty self-explanatory. I mean, again, writing style can even be different. You don't want complex sentences. You want really simple, declarative sentences. You want to use that active voice quite a bit. We talked about jargon. Ideas will start to repeat themselves even in just 3 pages. Have your reader do a check for that. I'm sure in social sciences we often need to be reminded about what paragraphing means. I know that humanities scholars aren't the same way, but the idea that every paragraph should have a topic sentence and an argument should flow and every paragraph should accomplish a point or a goal. And those paragraphs should line up next to each other in the progression of an argument. All helpful things for the blurry-eyed reviewer. It is okay to be really assertive, but you can't guarantee anything. So words like I expect, I'm confident that I will find this in the archive are really handy. Proofreading. Do consider formatting depending on how much leeway they give you. You can bold things or italicize. You can have subheads. Always good to see if there's examples of past successful proposals to see what those people did for the blurry-eyed reviewers. Very quickly, I mean, if there is a budget, if they do ask you to propose a budget, again, they're going to be reading your proposal and your budget next to your CV. You're going to want to know if you already look pretty well funded. Why do you need this? Maybe your funding that you have won't take you to this extra place. Answer the questions before they come up. I mean, a reviewer won't necessarily know your family situation, but they might query certain aspects of your budget if they seem to diverge from what might be expected of a graduate student. So again, things like a reviewer. I already really talked about the work through bibliography. Reviewers, they're humanists, right? They love bibliographies. So they're going to be reading them really closely, and they're going to want to see how things articulate in your work that are in your bibliography. Bibliography is certainly not an afterthought. Did you get everything in there that you were supposed to? And does the gap in your bibliography indicate the gap that you said your project was going into? Again, make sure that clarity lines up. Cite between your narrative and your bibliography, etc. We already talked a lot about letter writers, but it's really important because over a fifth or a quarter of your proposal. So again, I have come across a lot of literature that says it's helpful to have folks from writing letters from within your department, but also farther in the field from outside of the department, even from outside of the university. So here's where conference connections can be really handy. If you can pick up an informal mentor, someone you talk to after a panel, you buy some coffee, you're really interested in their work, etc. It is important that your letter writers have tenure. Not necessary, but important. Quite important. Things to give them, a CV, your polished proposal, not your rough draft, the thing you're done with. And the reason is because, again, you want to make sure that their letter agrees with your proposal. And we talked about notice. I really find it helpful that when people give me a list of bullet points that I'm counting on your letter to do these things for my application, to be this puzzle piece. It sounds a little forward, but I've been thanked for it when I give it to people, and I certainly think my students could do that for me. Okay, there's the anatomy of the proposal. Feedback is really important. We will organize some of it for you. Please.
Yes, okay, for the previous
Yes.
slide, you actually list bullet points of topics to address, so you kind of tell them what to write about you, or?
Don't tell them what to write, but tell them what points you need them to raise. Like what aspects of your work you need them to speak to.
So you actually give them the document with that list, right?
I do. I give them like bullet points in an email.
I mean, I like like the idea, but it's the first time I hear it, so just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly.
Don't leave any room for guesswork, is my advice. You know your advisors and mentors. If you think that's inappropriate, then don't push it, but I think it's wholly appropriate.
So that's a way of getting them kind of on the same page and just hitting the right stuff.
Exactly. Thank you.
Also, I think letter writers can talk to points on your CV. Like if you've been in grad school for a really long time, you might want to say to the advisor, could you address this? Let them know that I'm working 5 jobs at the same time, which might not be appropriate for you to raise, but a letter writer can add that biographical detail in a way that is not seen as inappropriate as it would if you, because it would sound like maybe you were complaining if you did it yourself, but you know, the letter writers can sometimes account for that, or if you change projects, or they can deal with things that you can't address directly in your proposal, and there may be no room on the application to deal with it. Those are the kinds of things I would let a letter writer know. This is for the job market as well as for grants. If you think there's some kind of weakness that you anticipate people identifying, you can ask for help then, I think, and that's acceptable.
That's excellent, thank you. So we will help organize review for your proposal. So if you're writing for something for fall funding deadlines, or even for spring, twice a year for the next 2 years, the Humanities Center will organize a single blind review process. So there is one this summer. If you'd like, you can send us your complete application minus reference letters, just like you'd submit it to the agency by July 1st, and we'll get you feedback from 3 people by mid-August, and you can revise it, increase your chances for the deadline. So if you'd like to participate in that, please email me or the Humanities Center. And just have 2 more very quick slides. And please let all your colleagues know the blue sheets, the blue papers that you may have taken are on the table also give details of this opportunity. To improve your grant writing skills, always ask for feedback, even if you don't get a grant. Not every place will give feedback, but some will. It doesn't hurt to ask. Take every opportunity that you can to sit in on review committees or search committees, or if the department wants to take a job candidate out for lunch or coffee, volunteer, and you can ask them about these backstage things as well as the front stage issues of their research. Ask them how they got money. And again, the networking. I have I'll leave this slide up at the end. These are just my short bibliography of things that I find helpful for grant writing in the humanities. We're not going to get to the exercise, but what I do advise you to do today is find somebody in a different discipline that you've just met here, exchange email addresses, and agree to be fellowship writing buddies, and agree to send each other, at the very least, your first introductory paragraphs, so you can hear what someone in another discipline thinks about it, how it resonates with them. So if you haven't met someone else yet, linger, have some more tea, and thank you all for coming. We do have evaluation sheets. We'd be really grateful if you could give us feedback on the presentation. Do you have any closing remarks? All right, thank you all, and good luck. Good luck with your work.